let's get the podcast news. So, okay, so Joe Budden podcast has recently been trending because Rory and Mal haven't been on the podcast. And there's supposed to be there's allegedly some sort of falling out. But here's the whole breakdown of the situation. A Redditor and a bunch of people on Twitter are basically confirming that this is pretty much what's going on. Avid listeners of Joe Budden's podcast are basically saying that Rory and Mal are on strike. Joe doesn't know if they'll ever come back, but if they do, they'll always have their seats. Ice and Savon are not the replacements, just who Joe could find to hold their seats while they figure out this miscommunication. According to Joe, it is just a miscommunication. It is not about money. It isn't a fight, just a miscommunication. And Parks adds in and says it's also business PTSD. Joe talked to both Mal and Rory even in their absence, and it is still his love. Joe believes they're coming back, and you can probably read the rest. I'll put this on the screen while I play Rory's take on it. Rory spoke on another podcast. I don't know what podcast this is, but Rory spoke on this podcast about passion for podcasting and blah, blah, blah. So we'll get into that, and I'll leave this on the screen. Before I get into that, okay, no, I'm going to get into it first, and then I'm going to react. So let's play this real quick.
Get out.
Yeah.
Get out.
Let's not fester and let this implode
And
way
there's
worse than it needs to do.
Correct. And there's no drama around.
Okay, so that was Rory giving his take on the situation on I don't know which podcast that is. My bad. Wherever he was speaking on. When I look at it and I just seeing all the information out there, seeing the breakdown that the Redditors provide, listening to Joe on his podcast break it down when they're not there, listening to Rory on that podcast, listening to DJ Academics going in on Rory and Mal, and just taking the wide scope of information and looking at it, I could definitely think it was financial. Joe says it's not financial, it's a miscommunication and blah, blah, blah. When I really look at it, it's like it's Joe Budden's podcast. He owns the IP. These guys are a part of the group, but probably thought that they deserve more than they did for some reason. But Joe is the one that got the Patreon deal. Joe's actually the person getting all the deals. These guys are pretty much workers for Joe, as Academics says. Academics is right about that. And I think they're not really they're not happy with their role. They ain't happy with what they're getting compensated with. The Spotify deal's up, so clearly the bag has been reduced, but Patreon is compensated. Joe has made the money back. Joe is not at a loss for money. That's why he's like it's not about money. For him, it's not about money. For them, it's probably about money. It's about status in the business. It's about ownership. But they don't bring that to the table. The Joe Budden podcast is originally popping, or originally had some sort of buzz, is because Joe was famous. The easiest way to get a popping podcast is have a famous motherfucker host a podcast. Just strictly off of being famous, you're gonna get eyes. And then Joe does a good job on his podcast, and these guys are support people, but they're not really. And then when he said something at the end, he said it's about us four. And everybody else is just in the back. And I think that he doesn't realize that he's everybody else. He's a part of the team. He's an employee. Joe is the star. But that's what happens when you do these group types of podcasts and you're all friends. The business gets put first, and anyone that's, a shrewd business person is going to get their worth. And that's what Joe does. And then after his worth is taken, I don't think there's any space for the rest of them. But they don't really bring as much to the table as Joe. And he talked about passion for podcasting. It seemed like it was all good before his fiance left him, and the Spotify deal is off the table, so money's probably reduced. I think Rory's probably in a bad spot in his life. They talked about Rory continuously wanting to fight Joe because the tension was so thick and everything that it's saying down here. Okay, so in the breakdown it says important. Joe told Rory to take a few podcasts off after tension got so thick between them. Rory agreed. Also important. Mal is standing with Rory, doesn't think Joe should have the power to tell Rory to stay home from the podcast. Apparently the convo got personal, and Joe said some things to Mal he shouldn't have said. Park said it didn't go well. He was there. So when he says miscommunication, Joe says miscommunication. That's probably right there the credence for him to say miscommunication. because they don't understand that it's not their show. It's Joe Budden's podcast. It's called the Joe Budden Podcast. There's a support team, and they're kind of interchangeable parts. And it sucks. It's a sad reality. But if you want more of the lion's share, then provide more, bring more to the platform, start your own show, do something different. But yes, a lot of these podcasts, a lot of these group podcasts have gone to shit. They switched up casts a lot of the times. You got to be solid in your foundation and know what you're bringing to the table and know what you're doing from the beginning, from the inception of the podcast. You got to learn, you got to know your worth, you got to know what you bring to the table and know your role at the end of the day. If you're not the star, but the podcast is performing at a certain level and you're not getting paid star money, it's like you got to understand you're not the star. It is what it is, man. Academics said a lot about these niggas, about Rory and Mal. Went in on them, provided a lot of perspective. I think a lot of people need to listen to ACK to give the insider, the industry insider news on them, to really break down and get the whole mentality behind their decisions to stop being on the podcast. But who knows? Okay, so a supporter, I don't know who this is, but this was trending on Twitter. Someone made a diss track because they felt so passionate about the breakup of, the Joe Budden podcast. So let's listen to this shit. Hopefully this doesn't get my thing flagged and copywritten and all that. Okay, so that was a diss track from a passionate fan breaking down everything, giving a little context of the situation. A lot of people hold it against Joe, and it's his public perception he's a bad businessman and he doesn't understand business and he expects certain things and he's kind of hypocritical in business. And that's kind of the public perception. How much of that is true, who knows? But some of his perspectives that he spews out there leads you to believe that he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about certain times and certain things in business he doesn't really understand. So it leads the viewer to believe that from the shit that he puts out there sometimes. But I don't know. I'm not siding with Rory and Mal here. You guys should have worked that out in the contracts, and man, it is what it is, man. I don't ever really side with people that are bummed out or bitching about bad contracts or bitching about their situations that they're in. You know what you signed up for. You're a grown ass man. And then that Mal tweet and the respect is non-negotiable. Well, yeah, it isn't. You feel your way, you're gonna go your way. It is what it is. Not much more to add there. We'll probably see these niggas back on the pod. What else we got here? Spent entirely too much time speaking about another podcast.